So welcome to week 2 of keeping your kids on God's side. So we're actually going to get into the content today of the book. So today's conversation is going to be conversations about God. We're going to have 2 weeks of this at least. We're going to see how much of the actual content we get through for the day. There's a lot to get through. When I was clocking it this week, it was right about an hour. So that's why I just don't want to wait too long to see if we can get through it all. So let's just jump right on into it. So first slide I have just kind of a brief question. So how do you find God? What would you guys, if someone were to ask you this, they would ask you, how do you find God? How would you respond? Okay, so singing, right? So it's like this connection that you feel to God through music, right? So that's so like where I'm going with this, I don't want you to feel like any of your responses are invalid, right? I'm more just trying to frame it from an atheist perspective or someone that might challenge our faith perspective. So singing is a great response, and actually some of the responses that you're going to give me, like, does anyone have another one that they might say? Like, how would you?
Out in nature.
So when you go out in nature, it's like you're observing God. Ryan, Carolyn, welcome. Take a seat, take a donut, take a syllabus. So, a syllabus. So, where was I? So just observing the creation, right? We know that from Romans 1:20 that's actually a way that we can know God is just through observing His creation. And so that's another really good response. So let's just kind of. So all of us have different ways that we might answer this question, right? And I want to just emphasize that those are probably some of the most valid ways that you can respond in a Christian context, right? Because that is how we know God. We know God through observing the creation. We know God through praying. We know God through reading the Bible. We know God through singing and music and making that connection. However, why might, and this kind of just encapsulates all of those kinds of answers, that still small voice, right? That little knowing inside of us. Why might that not quite cut it for our kids that are being challenged in their faith?
Because kids are too loud to hear. Peer pressure.
Peer pressure, yep. And they're going to be challenged in way. Oh, who's that? Coming on in? Oh, Josh, welcome. So grab a donut if you want it. Grab a syllabus and grab a seat. So, that's what Ryan said. So the reason that Natasha gives for this, and I think there's some truth to this, is that so evidence-based rationales have a lot of clout in our society today, right? So when we say something like, oh, it's that still small voice, it's when I pray, these aren't like evidential, things that we can give our kids to show people that are going to ask for evidence. So people that don't share our worldview, that don't have a Christian, that don't hold the Bible to be authoritative, they're going to want to know, well, what's your evidence for God? That's really what they're saying when they're saying, how do you find God? They're asking, well, what's your evidence? Show me your cards. And so they're going to want objective reasons for why it's reasonable to believe in God. And I know for me, like, I didn't really know this stuff existed as of that not that long ago. But does anyone know any objective reasons as to why God might be knowable? Something concrete? Just call it out.
I want to start with the premise that creation had to happen somewhere.
Okay.
Somehow. And the idea of things happening by chance is not, you can't go anywhere with that.
Right, it's too improbable. Yeah, okay, so that's actually...
That's the place where I like to start that conversation.
That's a good place to start, and actually that takes some elements for some of the arguments that we're going to talk. And when I say argument, I don't mean like fighting. I mean debating and just civil debate over a point. So the Kalam cosmological argument, it actually takes some of those elements that you were just talking about. Anyone ever hear of this? It's a very fancy name for something actually very simple. It's an argument that's based on 3 premises, and these are them. So anyone heard of William Lane Craig? So he's a pretty well-known apologist he's kind of like a modern one, but he started he created this Kalam cosmological argument. So these are the 3 premises. So everything that begins to exist had a cause. So I'm just going to kind of break down what these mean a little bit. So scientists actually used to believe that the universe was eternal. And then in 1920, Edwin Hubble discovered that the universe is expanding, right? And so when you reverse that, well, you end up at a single point called the singularity. And that's science's stance now, is that the universe actually had a beginning, and that moves into the second point. So the universe began to exist. And then finally, the third point is that the universe had a cause. So there's nothing that begins to exist does anyone have an example of something that began to exist that didn't have a cause? Right? It defies all logic. It defies everything that we know about the material universe even. So scientists actually have to agree with these 3 points. The last part that they don't agree with is when we attribute it to God, right? So just kind of like some like, it's not a game, but more of just an example I like to give. So if everyone could just close their eyes for a second and just imagine a complete void. There's nothing in there. So there's no atoms, there's no molecules, there's no nothing. Now, my question is, at what point does something come into existence? What's the answer? So you can open your eyes again. So at what point does something come into existence from that? When God speaks. Right. That's
because otherwise there's just nothing.
There's just nothing. But that still says God exists, so God is a something, right? So if there was nothing, would anything ever come into existence? A complete void? No, it never would. So I already asked that question. So the cosmological argument, this is kind of the next point, it doesn't contend that everything needs a cause. It's only those things that begin to exist. So what or who might not fit in that category? Cells?
They can't exist on their own.
Right. Yeah. So everything that begins to exist had a cause. But what might be that thing that doesn't need a cause? God. Right. So God, and why is that? Right. He never began to exist. Right. And so really, what we're talking about when scientists, we'll say secular scientists, and either Christian scientists or just Christians in general, talk about that, attributing that last part, the universe had a cause. When they attribute it to God, what we're doing is we're attributing it to an intelligent cause, a being rather, and then they're attributing it to essentially some form of supernatural matter that happened to explode into existence, right? Inert matter at that. They don't even pretend we had life back then, so it wasn't even active matter in the sense that we would typically think of it. And so you can make your judgment about which is more likely to actually cause the universe. Is it an intelligent cause, or is it going to be an inert cause? What's interesting to note is that God meets all of the qualifications of what would be required to make the universe. So in order to make something, you can't be that thing, right? I can't make myself, right? It has to be something outside of me that created me. So if we're going to make the universe, which is full of space, time, matter, you can't be space, time, matter. You have to be something outside of space, time, and matter, which just so happens, God fits all of those qualities. He's spaceless, he's spirit, he's massless, he's also spirit, and he's timeless, he's eternal. He's also extremely powerful, he's omnipotent, he's all-powerful, and he's all-knowing, he's omniscient. So you would imagine that, whoever's creating the universe, it's far more complicated to create the universe than it is to even create a computer, right? So it would have to be an intelligent being, by any logic anyway. Any questions on that? One of the coolest arguments. I think it's very simple but very powerful. Then we have the teleological argument, also a very fancy word for a very simple thing. Anyone ever heard of that before? The design arguments. This is the argument of design, and this one actually hangs up even atheist scholars quite a bit. I think it was Christopher Hitchens that doesn't actually know how to deal with this. When he was alive. So the universe is rife with evidence of design indicating the existence. Hello, Kate. Hello. Grab a donut, grab a syllabus, and grab a chair. So the universe is rife with evidence of design indicating the existence of a designer. And most scientists will actually indicate that the universe has the appearance of design and everything in the universe. So the world. So when you look at the human body, it looks like a machine, a very finely tuned machine. So does anyone have any? Yeah. So any ideas as to why scientists are very, very keen to say that it appears designed rather than it is designed, than the reality is that it's designed?
Because they don't have to explain it.
Right. So because where would they have to go if they explained it?
To the premise of creating it.
Right. It would, yes. If you're going to say it's designed, well, who designed it? And then they're either, again, they're arguing, well, matter designed it. Matter can't design anything. It's just matter. So it requires an intelligent cause. And so it's there. Anyone hear of the naturalism? Is that a familiar term with anyone? What does it mean?
Naturalism, isn't that when things develop? You can't use the word in definition.
Yes. Very good.
I know. I'm trying to think of a different word, but I'm stuck. What I would say along the lines of like, everything in our universe has its order, has its purpose, and all those things cannot just happenstantially happen. Like the way our bodies, all its different organs do their different things, and they serve their different purpose, and there's a space and a rhythm to all of those things. It doesn't just happen. I don't know if that's the right track, but that's where I go with that.
That might be another philosophy or another premise of some kind. But naturalism, typically what it's doing is it's actually just referring, in a fancy way, secularism. So everything that exists is limited to nature, right? So that's what it's referring to, is there's nothing that exists outside of what can be, sensed and touched, and yeah. So what's that?
Like Pocahontas and Grandmother Willow.
Right. Yeah. So that.
Everything comes from the earth and.
But even they have like a spiritual side to that, which naturalism is really just that very cold materialism. It's that because that would I'd have to think about that. I haven't really thought about Pocahontas. But
That's in his spare time.
but anyway, so naturalistic worldviews actually don't allow for a designer, and a lot of scientific enterprises will not even look. They won't even consider it as an option. And so when they look at something that appears to have a design, they can't allow for it to be designed because that's outside of their philosophical belief system. And so it's really, in a sense, it's not scientific because as a scientist, you would want to know all hypotheses and test all hypotheses. But they actually, because of their worldview, it limits them. So let's see. Let's keep going. So we're going to get into these. These are just like little snippets of examples of the teleological argument. We're going to get really into this, the nitty-gritty of it, towards the end of the class. We're going to talk about some of the science, the debate between like science and creationism and that stuff. So we'll get more into it. But here's just like a really fun example. So the DNA of every cell contains more information than 12 Encyclopedia Britannicas. And the level of intricacy suggests a designer. And the reason is because of this thing called specified complexity. So things that we know of in this universe that are designed all have this quality called specified complexity. And all that means is that they're complex to a degree that, how do I put this? We'll just say that they're very complex. So when the Declaration of Independence, for example, if someone were to write that out for you, or if you were to just come across the Declaration of Independence, you've never seen the Declaration of Independence before, you're going to assume that it was designed by someone because of its level of complexity and its other aspect, which is called its specification or specificity, which is the pattern. So language has a pattern that enables you to decipher information. And so when you have this combined quality of a pattern and a certain level of complexity. And what I mean by that is if you were to just go to the beach, right, and you happen to see like footprints make the word no, right? That's not nearly complex enough for us to actually consider it to be designed. It might have some level of pattern, but it's not design. It's not complex enough. So it has to kind of meet this threshold of being complex and specified. So any questions on that? Okay.
I like to think of eyeball. This is what I thought way back when. Like there are creatures that have cells that can sense light and dark.
Right.
And then there's creatures that have eyeballs. But there isn't really anything in between there, like if they were to evolve. There isn't like a half an eye or a little bit more of an eye or most of an eye, and then now we get an eye. No, it's you can either sense there's light and dark, or you have an eyeball that can see the world around you. Like you can't reduce the eyeball to something less than that.
Like something transitional, you mean?
Because it just doesn't work.
It's binary, in other words.
And why would something evolve that just didn't work? That would be weeded out in their thought. So you have an eye and you have almost an eye. That's it.
Right.
There isn't like a middle ground where it was growing into an eye slowly over time. So
Right.
like it's irreducible complexity because you can't get less than an eye. Because if you do,
Then you don't have an
you don't
eye.
have anything.
Right. Yeah. You just have a bump or something.
That's the one I always.
Right. Okay, that's interesting. I thought, oh, let's say I love talking to you guys. It's like I designed. I've read this whole thing and I'm getting like new information. So DNA extremely complex. It has specified complexity. It's one of the few things in the natural universe that we can specifically point to that has a pattern and that's extremely complex, which really does imply a designer. So and maybe some of that works too in it. I just have to think about it. But yes, that sounds like that might actually be imbued with some level of specified complexity as well, which you would imagine because it actually comes from DNA, right? So in order for the eye to develop, it actually is from the code. So that's kind of that's the source. So physics, the fine-tuned universe theory. This is one of my favorite things. So have any of you? Do you know about the fine-tuned universe theory?
Yeah, I've heard.
Okay.
I don't know a lot.
I don't know that much about it either, but there's some pretty compelling stuff in there. So what the fine-tuned universe theory, there's design in physics. So everything's fine-tuned with such precision that if one parameter were slightly changed, life would cease to exist. The universe would end up in chaos. You think of gravity, right? If the equation for gravity was slightly off, the planets would just spin off into total chaos. Some other kind of cool ones, the sun. If that was a tiny bit closer or a tiny bit further away, we'd end up like Venus or Mars, where it would be too cold or too hot to inhabit life. Something that I didn't know about, Jupiter. Anyone know the function that Jupiter plays in the universe? It's our trash can. Yeah. So it sucks in all the asteroids, because otherwise they would all just slam into Earth, and of course life would be impossible on Earth if we didn't have Jupiter there. But my favorite is the moon. Have you ever thought about how the moon is the exact same size from our perspective as the sun? Exact. When we have a solar eclipse, it covers it exactly. And just the odds of that are just astronomical. No pun intended. No. But some ways that some other philosophers, far better than me, have thought about this. So we have William Paley in 1802. If you encountered a watch in an open field, you would immediately assume it was designed. Kind of like that Declaration of Independence example that I was given just a bit ago. You would not look at that and go, oh, I wonder what form of natural matter this is, or what rock this came from. It has the appearance of design, and we would never assume it was anything other than that. And then Sean McDowell, who's he's more of a contemporary apologist. He's like in his 40s now. It's as though this is like a quote from him. It's as though we happen to stumble on a cabin that happens to be playing our favorite music, our favorite video game on the TV, and our favorite foods and drinks are in the fridge. And then asking if this is a coincidence. If our grandmother made all of our favorite meals, we don't assume that, it came from some stranger. We know, okay, grandma knows me and has prepared this such that it's for my needs. And that's really just when you look at all the constants going on in the universe, it's probably actually less likely that the universe was created by an accident than it is for you to just stumble into a cabin like that. So kind of a cool argument. Then we have the moral argument. So we have a couple of objections. This is actually another. I don't know which one's my favorite. They're all really cool. But objection number one. Morality is subjective because it varies between cultures. Some of us have probably heard this before, maybe. What are your thoughts on this objection? Anyone have any thoughts?
Yes and no. Of course things are subjective and different between cultures, that just makes sense. But over the course of time, taking something from someone that doesn't belong to you is always wrong. Killing somebody because you're angry is always across cultures wrong. I mean, you can get into nitty-gritty, in this country a kid can work when they're 12, well here they can't work till 16. But the premise of children being children and at 1 and 2 years old they belong as part of a family is the same across cultures.
Right.
You can pick anything you want in that statement and find something that doesn't fit. But big picture wise,
I was going to say, when you get down to the very central,
morality.
Core.
what is the lowest common denominator ever?
I mean, that goes back to
It's very.
Now, but see, now certain cultures have had different. Child sacrifice, for example, was a widely accepted thing, as we know from the Bible, right? Where they actually considered it moral because that was you were appeasing the gods or whatever. Nazis, perfectly fine to kill Jews, according to their philosophy. So you'll have like these exceptions to that. However, when we look at that, we know that they were wrong, right?
And that list of exceptions, because you can make exceptions for anything you want,
Right.
is much smaller than the list of constants. Or societies where
Oh, sure, like
your exception list is this long
right.
compared to your list of other cultures where those ideas were not accepted.
The question is it purely majoritarian? Is that the only reason why we know it's true, or is there something else?
No, but I think the majority plays a role.
It speaks to it, right? Okay, I like that. So where she goes with this, and I kind of like this. So when we say morality is subjective because it varies between cultures, what's really being said is that when there's disagreement, there is no truth, right? So when there's variance, when there's variation between two cultures, and they don't agree on something, they're basically saying, well, we can't know the truth because there's disagreement. So the way that I illustrate that, one time, my aunt sent me, I think it was like a check or something, and I had moved. And so she sent it to me, thinking that I lived at this particular address. And sometime later, because obviously I never said thank you because I didn't know she sent it. She's like, did you ever get that check I sent you? And I said, well, no, I didn't. And she's like, well, you live here. And she gave me the address. I'm like, no, I live here. And she said, no, you live here. And I was like, I'm pretty sure I don't live there anymore. But did our disagreement mean that you couldn't discern where I lived? Right? That's an absurd conclusion to draw, right? I knew where I lived because I know where I live. She just was misinformed and couldn't really articulate that. So when there's disagreement, doesn't mean that you can't find the truth. So then we have morals as a matter of personal opinion, right? They're kind of interconnected, these two objections. But any thoughts on that one? Are morals just a matter of personal opinion? Right.
But if that were the case, if they were opinion,
Right.
then it would literally be chaos.
It would.
Because
Yes.
everybody would have, this is what I think about it, and I don't care what you think, because that's okay for me.
Right.
Which is kind of what we're seeing in the culture.
We are relativism. Yeah. Yes.
And how well is that working out for us?
Yeah, and you can illustrate this very easily. I mean, all you have to say is, okay, I'm going to steal your car. I'm going to hotwire your car. I'm going to take it, and it's mine now. And they're going to be very upset about that. And you can ask them, well, why are you so upset?
Yeah.
Right. So it's mine. Right.
And it's just little things like that where like all of a sudden now you're stepping on their toes and it's like, well, wait, we can't. Oh, so there is some underlying code that we all think is true.
We've had this conversation with
Yeah, we all
kids
intuitively
in
know.
regards to whose Legos are whose. Like, right? I mean, honestly, right?
Right.
So well, it's okay for you to take your brother's stuff, but you can't,
But if they say the best one is yours, then what do you do?
that's how we have this conversation with our kids like this. They can't be subjective.
Right. You can't just invent your own morals because it will eventually turn on you.
They try.
Yeah, I'm sure they do. I'm sure they do.
But if you look at little kids know instinctively what is right and what is wrong from the time they're born. Well, they can, as soon as they can articulate that.
Right.
And they will try, they may say, well, they are mine. I didn't take those.
Right.
And trying to get around it. So I guess it goes to show that
We have a sinful nature. Right?
everybody from the beginning of life has something instilled.
I think too, because we're coming across it more with Jake as he's 10. Nicole, you might think about this too with older kids, but his brain, and maybe it's just Jake's special, but his brain thinks about things in black and white ways.
Okay.
Like that things are right or that they're wrong.
Wrong.
And then trying to explain to him that there are some areas where they're definitive right, like kids are born with a definitive sense of right and wrong. And I think they are closer to the way God created us to be than we are as adults.
That's a cool thought. I think that might be true. They're also born with a sinful nature too, right? Because they try to get around those.
Closer.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. Right. So really where we're going with this is that the existence of objective moral laws is just a lawgiver who created them. So, think of our own country. If there was no one to enforce the law, if there was no one to create the law, what happens to the law? It goes away, right? So unless there's a lawgiver, you can't actually have an objective law. And of course, who could that possibly be? Because if you reduce it to the culture, right? If you take God out of it, and you put it on the presidents or the kings or the mullahs or whoever, now they're the arbiters of morality. What happens?
Same kind of thing. It just ends up in the chaos.
They're going to decide what's moral and what's not. That's how you get things like the Nazis declaring that killing Jews is a moral and good thing to do. Is they can call all the shots. So you'd be forced to say that there actually is no objective morality. It's just whatever the culture says at the time. And I mean, I think you see that in our culture right now very strongly, is that they deny any existence of an objective morality, and they try to invent it, and that's how they get into all sorts of trouble. But yeah, you would be forced to say that Mao, Nazism, any kind of evil that's ever been perpetrated in our world, it couldn't actually be said that it's objectively wrong. It's just what you don't like, basically, is what that turns into. And then this last point, so you don't need to know God to do moral deeds. So atheists actually, they can do moral deeds, right? Because God wrote it on our hearts. But just because they don't know God doesn't mean that there isn't actually a creator and enforcer of those laws, even if they deny that, right? So she kind of just made that point. So how could God allow evil? So this is a very popular objection to the Christian faith, is that, well, if God is this wonderful good being, in fact, if he's all good, well, where did all this evil come from, right? So anybody ever answer that in their own life? Like, what are some of your thoughts about that?
It gets a little personal for me, but back when my dad got sick, this was a question that I really fought with, because I was sure God was going to make Dad better. And my dad is now. That being said, I asked my dad this question and said, "This isn't fair. This isn't right. Why is this happening?" And his response to me at that time was, "Carolyn, do you really think that my ALS is part of God's plan for me?" He said, "Absolutely not." He said, "I know God doesn't want this kind of sickness for anybody." He said, "But we live in a world where there is sin and where we are separated from God. And if we are separated from God, there are going to be things that don't fit in with his plan. God can use those things, but it doesn't mean that all those things are part of his original design for us. That's part of our separation from him."
Right. Yeah, absolutely. That's a wonderful way of reasoning through that.
We worked through that I worked through that for a while.
That's a journey too. Like that's because of all the emotional stuff
Emotions are real.
going on with that. And so so when I talk about some of these subjects, 'cause some of the subjects we're going to talk about today are a little rough. This being one of them, but just some of the challenges are unfortunately very emotionally taxing. So let's just kind of let's just kind of go into maybe what she brings up. So if God created everything and evil is something, then didn't God create evil? So there is a flaw in this way of thinking because we're considering evil to be something. I think of it more, or the way that it's illustrated metaphorically is we can think of goodness or God's goodness as being light, right? It's portrayed that way in the Bible a number of times. And if we're thinking of light, well, what is darkness? Is darkness a thing or is it something else? Absence. Yes, it's a lack of something. So, God didn't create evil. Evil is just an absence of him, right? So we can just think of it that way. Now the question is, why didn't God make it so that humans could do evil? Any thoughts on that? Or why didn't he make it so that humans were perfect? Yeah, in the very beginning, but what? Because not quite, because we still could sin, right? So
We can make a choice.
right. It hinges upon our ability to make decisions, right? Which it appears that's what God wanted to preserve. If he didn't, he wouldn't allow us to make decisions. And it's our C.S. Lewis. Do I quote him yet? Yeah. So the only way that God could destroy moral evil, which is the evil that humans perpetrate, is to destroy our freedom, right? And part of that freedom is our capacity to reciprocate with God, right? To have this loving relationship, to have a relationship. You cannot have a relationship with a robot, right? With an automaton. You have to give them this opportunity to make decisions. Think of like we have kids. Aladdin, right? What couldn't the genie do for Aladdin? Anyone remember? What's that? There's a few of them. Fall in love, right? He couldn't make someone fall in love with him, and so. but yeah, so he. So he couldn't make humans fall in love with him if we couldn't make decisions. Falling in love is a decision. Now there are people that will argue that it's not. That they say it's God's sovereignty and He draws us to Him, and then that's getting into the Calvinist versus Arminian debate. But we're not going to get into that today. But in order to preserve our freedom, He needs to allow us to make decisions. So that's the basic premise. No, I don't want to do that yet. So C.S. Lewis says it this way. So free will, though it makes evil possible, is also the only thing that makes possible any love, goodness, or joy worth having. So that's kind of just a nice way to sum that idea up. So he allows evil because without that, we cannot have freedom. So limits to God. Are there things that God can't do? Can He tell a lie? I know, like I played this trick on me too. Right. Can He make a square circle? It's a contradiction of terms, right?
I was going to say, if as far as like making a circle not a circle anymore, then no, because a circle is true in itself. So you can't make something that is true untrue.
Right. Yes, that's the point I think I'm trying to drive at. Is He cannot do contradictions, like things that undercut themselves like that. You can't force someone to freely do something. Is kind of like where that's going. It contradicts itself, right? So natural evil. I think you can probably guess what that might be based on the picture. Things that naturally happen. This kind of comes back to what we were talking about with your dad, right? So disease falls under that category, right? It's something that no one caused your dad to get that disease, and yet nature seems to have allowed for it to happen. And this is a tougher question, and I think actually Carolyn answered it really well.
Actually, Dad did.
Or Dad, yes, okay. So Natasha brings up the argument. This is kind of her way. I don't like this argument. So she brings up the idea that natural evil is a byproduct of good processes, and the way that she illustrates it is that. That's what I'm going to talk about. So volcanoes and earthquakes, for example, they cause mass destruction, but they also create land, right? So land we can consider a good thing, and obviously destruction not so good. I don't like that way of reasoning because I think it's a contradiction to say that good processes entail bad processes. It doesn't take God off the hook, in other words. I kind of have this alternative way of thinking about it, which is that the existence of moral evil entails natural evil, which is somewhat tied to what you were talking about earlier. It's, from the Christian perspective, where did evil come from?
People sin.
Right, when Adam and Eve, committed their first sin, it wasn't just them that were defiled. It was the world, right? It now became difficult to till the earth, right? It can be. It doesn't say this explicitly, but we can take it that there probably weren't hurricanes and tornadoes before that time, or earthquakes or all that stuff. So at that original sin, it essentially broke the world, and then out of that, we get all sorts of moral evil because we were corrupted as well. What's that?
Broke the world. I thought that was funny. You're absolutely right. I just thought it was a funny.
Yes, an interesting way of putting that. So natural evil didn't exist until the fall, indicating moral evil caused natural evil. And something that I kind of say is that the process also works in reverse. So if we can think of it, so let's start up here with Adam, right? So Adam sins. He causes all the evil that happens in the world, and eventually that culminates in an evil thing happening to Adam, Adam being metaphorical at this point, so to us, right? So bad things happen to us, and we're just in this very, corrupt state. However, what can happen as a result of some of those things? when we get these terminal illnesses, or we have, say, our home gets destroyed by an earthquake or a hurricane or whatever, what does that sometimes, not all the time, compel us to do?
Have a change of heart.
Have a change of heart, and who would you press into? God, right? So sometimes these calamities that come upon our life compel us to press ourselves into God. And is there a better moral good than pressing into God, potentially, enacting your salvation and giving you access to heaven, right? So sometimes, not all the time, right? Because we still have that thing called free will. So we can get down to that bottom point and still shake our fist at God. But really, it has this potential to mend that relationship again that was originally corrupted by that first very bad decision, right?
I think it goes back to what Karen, what your dad said, that if bad things happen to people because of evil and sin,
Right.
but God can use those.
Right, he can mend that.
I think so often though people mix up God being able to use a situation versus God's causation of that thing. And so I think sometimes people mix up, say, well, God let this happen. We have to separate the two between this did happen and God caused it. God wanted it. It's God's fault.
Right. And
I think that's
yeah.
where people get really hung up on this one, that if it happened, well then it must have been God's will, or like that this horrible thing happened. And God doesn't have plans that are going to bring hardship and death into our lives, but God can use those things.
Especially when the greater good can happen on the other side, right? So he can use those things so that he can. I mean, just mending the relationship. There's no greater good than that, right? To bring us into Him. And sometimes He does use some rather drastic measures, or allows some drastic measures to occur in order to allow that to happen. So.
Yeah, because I'm reading through Ezekiel, which I'm just kind of reading through the Bible stuff, and it is terrible. Like, God's saying, hey, all of this bad stuff is going to happen. These nations are going to come conquer you. You're going to be wiped out. And I don't know. I guess I'm having a little bit of trouble putting that in with this too, because God is allowing these things to happen, telling Ezekiel that, hey, this stuff is going to happen to Israel. Like,
Right.
But that doesn't.
pay attention.
Right.
Revelation. God reading through Revelation and the stuff that, like the.
Well, now,
prophecies
yeah. So now we're getting into judgment territory, possibly. So, and actually, I have some slides on that. So let's just keep going forward, so that we can maybe hit that. Last point I had: natural evil can be used to temper our sinful nature, right? So when we think of what was that proverb? I'm always bad at, like idle hands or the devil's workshop or something like that. So when we're not doing things like putting ourselves to good use and doing something like tilling the soil, right? So when God made it very difficult for Adam to till that soil, we can look at that as that's his way of tempering his sinful nature so that he's not furthering his sin, in a certain way. I don't know if that makes sense, but difficult things can actually help prevent us from acting on our sin. I don't know, just a thought that I had. I think, was that everything? It can also be judgment, which is not necessarily bad, and we'll get to that in a little bit. Okay, so evil implies God's existence, not his absence. So this kind of comes back to what we were saying earlier. So the fact that evil exists means that there's a recognition of what's good, right? So if we see bad things, if we're able to recognize good from, if we're not able to recognize something as evil, it must mean that we recognize that there's an alternative that's better. But of course, what we were saying earlier, if we don't have a moral lawgiver, then there is no right or wrong, there is no good or evil. And so if we are recognizing good and evil, it means that there must also be a lawgiver. So the very argument that they were using against God, that because evil exists, there is no God, it actually undercuts itself, because if you're recognizing that there's an objective evil, then it actually means that there must be a lawgiver that is making a difference between evil and good. Does that make sense? Think? Okay. Just stop me if something, because some of this gets a little heady. Okay, more difficult subjects. Why would God command genocide? All right, so when we look at the conquest of Joshua, this is something that people will bring up. Is just like, how could he possibly allow his people to kill men, women, and children, some of whom are assumed to be innocent, especially with the children. So I Yep, so I just said that. So, so the argument is that if God were good, he would stop genocide, and the question is whether or not the killing is justifiable. So, any thoughts on this before I jump in? Not yet? Okay. So when we look at the trajectory of what was going on with the conquest of Joshua, in Genesis 15, God promises Abraham the eventual inheritance of Canaan, but there were Canaanites already living there. We also know from Leviticus that the Canaanites were a depraved people, that they were committing a multitude of abominations, adultery, child sacrifice, bestiality, all sorts of stuff that we would know to be horrible. And God wanted to guard the purity of his people, the people that were going to carry his covenant all the way up until Jesus, right? They were going to be essentially the gatekeepers, and so he wanted to guard their purity at that time. Now, of course, if any of us know from reading our Old Testament, they didn't do that very well, right? So they're constantly this back and forth where Israel's sinning and they're worshiping, idols and all that stuff, and that's why they got deported to Babylon. And so they didn't keep it very well, but that was the intention, right? So skeptics, let's see, do I talk about that? Yeah, they have difficulty with the command to kill every single Canaanite, with this idea that they couldn't have all been evil. Right, and what are they really saying with that? Any idea as to what that really, the connotation of that is? They couldn't have all been evil? So it kind of has this implied hierarchy, right? Like some sins are worse than others, right? So when we say that they couldn't have all been evil, we're okay. They might have lied, but they didn't kill anyone, right? Which, actually, I think when you look closely at the cultures of the time, child sacrifice was a common occurrence in these cultures, and they considered it to be a moral good, right? So from a certain way of looking at it, it's mere conjecture to say that the Canaanites were not universally evil in the way that we would consider it, even from a human perspective, because of things like that. So it may very well have been universal in their culture, and just to say that they couldn't have all been evil, even from a human perspective, is conjecture. But of course, do they have to be committing child sacrifice to be evil from God's perspective? Right. No, there's an absolute form of the law, and then there's a more relative form of the law. Of course, down here, we can't operate by the absolute form because we all do it, right? We all sin. If we were to kill every single liar, we'd all die, immediately, and anyone who then condemned that person would end up a hypocrite. So it doesn't work on a relative level, but God is justified in doing that because he is the absence of all that. He is pure good, right? So the bottom of that, or let's just kind of hit that. So the conquering of Canaan was God's judgment on an evil group of people. And you can leave it at that. And then I've got a few slides that just kind of, I think it's a little redundant, so we're just going to try to fly through them. So was God's command immoral? We define genocide, so it's the systematic extermination of a national, racial, political, or cultural group. So God's command of genocide is not morally comparable to humans committing genocide because we know what the reason why humans are committing genocide. So with the Nazis, for example, they didn't actually have a morally justifiable reason. They just said, well, we just don't believe Jews are worthy of life, which of course is not a good reason to kill someone. However, God has very good reasons to enact his judgment, and only he knows them, right? So he knows what's going on inside the human heart. We don't. So if anyone has the ability to justly enact something like genocide, it would be God. And when humans take objection to the judgment of a perfectly just and holy God, it's actually a reflection of our own sense of discernment, or our limited sense of discernment, right? When we think something is unfair.
I want to ask the question, though, how does this conversation look with someone that doesn't view God as the ultimate authority? Because we're coming back to say to them, well, God's understanding of the depravity of the Canaanites at that time is God is good and he's the only one that can know that.
Mm-hmm.
But if you don't view God as the authority who is the ultimate judge of people, you still feel like you're going to be in a circle with this conversation.
Well, so at this point, we've accepted that God, in order to have this conversation at all, we have to accept that God is a thing and God is real. Otherwise, because at this point, if we're going to take from the atheist perspective, this doesn't even make sense. Because God couldn't enact judgment, and it was just the Israelites being evil.
So at this point in the conversation, we believe that God already exists, and now we're talking about in conversation, his authority over people.
Right, because the accusation that whoever it is, atheist or polytheist, whoever it is, the accusation that they're making is your God is evil because he commanded people to do genocide. So they're conceding for at least that moment that God is a thing. It's an entity.
Is in existence, and therefore his authority is bad. Is the
That's what they're arguing in this instance. Yeah. I know. Maybe you'll have a question that I can't answer because that's very likely. So were the Canaanites bad enough? Skeptics argue that the Canaanites adopted the practices of their ancestors and were ignorant of their sin. So we know through several verses, we talked about it earlier, Romans 1:20. So we don't need the Mosaic law to know that we're sinning because from the creation of the world, God's eternal power and divine nature has been clearly seen, and this would include the ability to discern right from wrong, good from evil. And so we can deduce from that the people, of Canaan, in this case, people in Jericho, were aware that they were sinning and they were choosing to do otherwise. In Genesis 3:15, also God gave plenty of time for the Amorites, which was a Canaanite group, to repent. Right, he gave them 400 years actually to repent of their sin. So it wasn't like we can say that God didn't give them a chance. Which is what they would say. They would say God should have given them an opportunity to repent. He did. He gave them 400 years, but they never did. Any questions on that? Makes sense. So why children? So I felt like I had to address this question because she put it in the book and then never answered it. So you can't just say that God killed children and then not address it. The way that we can think about this is anyone deserving of God's forgiveness? No. So we know that from Romans 3:23, so no one's righteous, not even one. This would include children. Now, if we want clarification on that, we can go to Psalm 51:5, where it says, surely I was sinful from the time my mother conceived me. So really, from the time of conception, we have that sin thing.
We know that our children from the time they're 2 will look you in the face and lie to you.
Yes. So I don't need to convince you guys of that. Judgment on all humanity is perfectly justifiable. Grace is unfair to God. So if God wanted to blow up the world right now, he would actually not be evil because of that, because we are evil, right? And so when he saves us, this is actually an extreme form of forgiveness. It's forgiveness that we actually can't understand on earth. The way that it's illustrated is if we can imagine someone's on trial for committing murder or something, and you have God as the judge, he's also the lawyer, and he's also the offended party. He's all three. And basically what you have in this situation is actually the criminal, attacked the judge pretty much. He went at him with a knife, injured him potentially. God doesn't get injured, but yes. But for the sake of the metaphor, he injured God. And the judge steps down in the form of the lawyer and says, I will take the punishment because he's also the offended party, right? So he's all three. So the only person that could really fairly or justly do that is the offended party, right? So if you're not the offended party and the judge says, this other guy who's not the criminal is going to take the punishment, well, that's not fair, right? That would not be just, right? But because he is the offended party and the judge, he can make a decision like that and have it still be just, even though it's extremely unfair, right? So does that make sense? So that's kind of just putting that into perspective. I felt like I had to, just do that to show that this whole situation is much more unfair to God than it is to us. So it's unlikely that God passed ultimate judgment on children, meaning that they did not go to hell. So even the kids in Jericho, and we can look to 2 Samuel for that, when David says, so when David's son died that he had with Bathsheba, does everyone remember this? And he said, I will go to him, but he will not return to me. So when he had that adulterous relationship, he had that child. It was very sick, or the child was very sick, and he was praying and praying and praying and praying. And then when it finally passed away, this is what he said. He's, someone asked him, well, why did you stop praying? And he said, I will go to him, but he will not return to me. Which really does say that this child, who we could not have possibly known if he accepted, that had faith in God, went to heaven, right? Because the assumption is that David expected to go to heaven. So if you're not accountable, if you can't be held accountable for your actions, the assumption is that you go to heaven. Sometimes innocent people get hurt when the people responsible for them make poor choices, right? So in the case of, say we have an alcoholic, right? An alcoholic father, and his whole family hops into the car with him. He's been drinking all day. They get into an accident. The whole family dies. Who's responsible? The father, right? The father's responsible. Would anyone say God's responsible for that? No. that's essentially what's going on with the people of Jericho. They're committing all this sin that would warrant judgment, right? And so when that finally does come full circle and then they're judged, well, they're the irresponsible parents committing extremely immoral deeds that eventually cause their judgment. And so the dynamics are a little bit different. There's this spiritual element to that where God's judgment is happening, but it's the same set of circumstances. They're committing an immoral, acts that would warrant judgment, and then when the judgment happens, we seem to want to blame God, but it's actually the irresponsible parents that we should be looking to in that situation. Questions on that? Make sense? What's that?
It's a problem in school.
What?
Just the blaming of people that shouldn't.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I'm sure.
Sorry, that's what my brain went.
Okay. Yep. All right. I always talked about that.
Parents and everyone is taking responsibility. That's my point.
That seems to be like a newer thing, as I feel like it used to be, different in that way. Yeah. So how can God send people to hell? So people are often perplexed about how God's love could allow for punishment, but is punishment or justice at odds with love? Any thoughts on this? Okay, so Carolyn's firmly. So we're all in agreement that justice is a part of love, right?
It has to be, or the chaos thing reigns again.
Right. Okay, that's perfect. Here's my question. Would it be loving for a judge to exonerate a serial killer in the name of love? Right. And why not?
Because there has to be some kind of, reciprocation. Yeah.
Who would that be extremely unloving?
Discipline almost.
Right. Who would that be extremely unloving to?
All the victims, families.
That's right. So when we have this thing called sin, when we accept sin as a real thing, it would imply that that there's an actual law, because without a law you don't have sin, and if you have a transgression of that law, which is what sin is, you would expect a penalty, right? Just like you would in a normal court of law today. So if God exists, it would be expected that there would be a penalty for breaking His laws, just in the way that you would in a normal court of law. So people are often perplexed with. I already talked about that. Let's just look at my notes.
But the question is wrong. God's not sending people there. The assumption is that God is doing that, and that everybody wants their freedom to make their own choices for everything else except right here.
Right. I think I already. Yes. So we're gonna. Yeah. So when we find ourselves unable to see, so this is kind of part of that. So when we find ourselves unable to see how justice is a form, justice for sin is a form of love, is because we're failing to we're not recognizing the gravity of our sin. When we think that, it's kind of back to that hierarchy again. When we see God won't send me to hell because I lied. Well, God is perfect good. So you can't be in the presence of something that's perfectly good unless it's covered up or covered over. So if it's not covered over in some way. I feel like some of these slides are very redundant. Who should be punished? So the idea of hell is usually palatable for people who have done horrific things, so murder, rape, child molestation, but less so for the garden variety sinner, meaning the liars, hotheads. Yeah, that's a really funny term, garden variety sinner. But that's essentially, it's referring to that hierarchy. So the garden variety sinner being the one that does the sins that everyone does, and then the horrific one being the one that does the sins that most of us don't do. So returning back to the everyone's sin, and the punishment for sin is death. And outside of Christ's sacrifice, everyone is going to hell. So this is obviously an important point. So 99% obedience is actually 100% disobedience, right? So when we break the law even by 1%, it makes us completely guilty. And I think a good way of illustrating that is that if I were to say, I'm faithful to my wife 99% of the time, or I don't kill people 99% of the time, right? It's a ridiculous, it's a ridiculous statement, right? But it shows how 99% obedience is actually, it doesn't cut it, right? You have to be fully obedient. The only way that we can do that is by accepting Christ's sacrifice on the cross. So there might be differing levels of punishment. Sorry, hopefully, give me another 2 minutes. Might be differing levels of punishment. So just some verses that that speak to that so this is from Luke 12. So the servant who knew his master's will but did not act according to his will receive a severe beating, but the one who did not know and did what deserved a beating will receive a light beating. So there might be differing levels of punishment in hell. It seems to maybe imply that, but Who knows? So, what should the punishment be? So I kind of touched on all these. So people assume that their way of thinking is the same as God's way of thinking. Yes, there's Judge Judy, which is obviously a poor way of thinking about it. You know, when we try to take the perspective of God, we don't know what God. We can't do that, right? We can't look at things the way that God looks at things, and so we're not going to be able to make that reasonable judgment. We also have to look to the Bible. I know, and so again. We're talking about, we're accepting the Bible's authority at this point, so we're not really, this is kind of when atheists are arguing against the Bible in this way. So we have to look, if we're gonna get an idea for what hell might be like, we have to actually look at what the Bible says. So it calls it unquenchable fire. It calls outer darkness a fiery furnace, a place of spiritual and bodily destruction. And so you get these three different views on hell. You have the literal view, which personally, I don't see any reason not to believe in the literal view. So this is the way I take it. It's a place of actual fire where non-believers experience unending torment. And then we have the metaphorical view, which to me is not that different than the literal view. It's just maybe metaphorical fire. So it's a different form of torment than fire. So fire is merely like a biblical symbol for judgment. And you have the conditionalist view, which I think is not biblical, which is that those who are unsaved will cease to exist, this annihilationist view. The way that it's described as this place of weeping and gnashing of teeth, if it wasn't that, then and you were just annihilated, then how could it be a place of weeping and gnashing of teeth? It actually doesn't make sense. But I think it comes from this last one, a place of spiritual and bodily destruction. I think they interpret that bodily destruction as this annihilation instead of, essentially torture. But there's hope, right? So we have C.S. Lewis. There's only two kinds of people: those who say, "Thy will be done" to God, meaning that I submit to God, and those to whom God says, "Thy will be done," meaning I'm allowing your sinful nature to play itself out because you're choosing it. All that are in hell choose it, right? So that's kind of speaking to, we're putting God on the hook for hell when it's actually us that are allowing ourselves to go there. So hell can be avoided if we accept Christ's sacrifice on the cross, and it's really that simple. Any questions? So I only went a little bit over from that. There's a lot to take in. Does it all make sense, or is there any issues that I didn't, meet to your satisfaction?